She came into his life on an ordinary night, introduced by friends at an unpretentious dinner, and contrary to everything he thought he needed, Emily was chaos and color. She spoke with her hands, had a free laugh, and tears easily. He worked in events and lived with a schedule in tatters, but with a full heart. He always had something to say, something to feel, something to dream. And that was exactly what attracted him to her, the way she made everything seem more alive. They were opposites in almost every way, but there was a kind of harmony that united them. While Noah preferred quiet nights at home, Emily loved the excitement of the streets. He was the type to plan dinners, she forgot to buy the ingredients. And even with these differences, or perhaps because of them, they complemented each other in a surprising way. He gave ground, she gave wings. He brought silence when everything screamed, she brought noise when everything fell silent. Together, they created a home that wasn't perfect, but it was real. A small apartment, smelling of fresh coffee in the morning and stacks of books beside the sofa. Plants in every corner, some surviving out of stubbornness, others blooming without warning. It was a home built on daily choices, from who did the dishes to which movie to watch on a Friday night. Noah always considered love a silent pact. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but of constancy. He woke up early and made her coffee even when she didn't drink it. He left short notes in unexpected corners, sometimes with just a heart drawn on them. He didn't say, "I love you," every day, but he looked at her like someone who loves silently. Emily, on the other hand, was intense. She needed words, confirmation, warmth. She wanted to feel desired, admired, placed at the center of a world already too full of distractions. And over time, this need began to clash with Noah's more restrained form of love. He didn't change. He continued with his simple gestures, his firm presence. But Emily began to miss something, or thought she did. She began to doubt whether she was still seen, whether she was still special. Not for lack of love, but perhaps because of excessive expectations. The first few years were intense. There were plans and trips, impromptu dinners and lazy afternoons laughing at silly things. They created traditions of their own, like eating pancakes for Sunday dinner or listening to the same playlist every time they cleaned the house. But little by little, the routine became tighter. Emily began taking on more projects, working late, and arriving home exhausted. Noah, with his predictable stability, continued with the same schedule, the same habits. And that difference that once seemed complementary now seemed to separate them. He didn't stop her from growing, but she began to feel like she was growing alone. He didn't stop loving, but she began to doubt if she was still loved in the same way. There were no constant fights, no yelling. But the silence between them grew thicker. Talk about children was postponed. Kisses became shorter. Nights on the couch became spent on separate phones. Even so, there was affection. When she came home late, he left the living room light on. When he was sick, she made soup and cared for him with visible tenderness. But a distance was growing between them, and neither of them knew quite how to bridge it. Life, with its rush, kept pushing them in different directions, even though they slept in the same bed. And it was in this space, this gap between routine and desire, that their story began to change. But there was still no betrayal, no deep hurt. There was just a woman trying to understand if she was still the same person within that relationship, and a man trying to hold together everything that, for him, still made sense. Noah, despite everything, continued to believe. He had no problem loving without fanfare. He believed true love was the kind that endured even on ordinary days. He didn't worry about constant surprises, but about stability. For him, love was knowing she would be there when he arrived, and that he would be there for her, always. Emily, however, increasingly caught up in the fast pace of her events, surrounded by intense people, began to see her own relationship as something too gray. She compared, even unintentionally. New people were coming all the time, easy compliments, lighter conversations, mutual interest in new things. And that was starting to stir something inside her. It wasn't disrespect, yet. It was a restlessness. A subtle but persistent emptiness. An unanswered question, is that all? But she never said anything. Not with words. At most, a long sigh, a lost look, a change of subject when he tried to touch on something deeper. And he, who knew every detail of her, understood, but didn't know what to do. I was afraid to ask and hear what I didn't want to. I preferred to believe it was just a phase. That it would pass. That it was fatigue. Work. Time. And so, day after day, they maintained a semblance of normalcy. To their friends, they were the exemplary couple. The ones who seemed to understand each other with a look. Who worked because they knew how to respect each other's space. But inside, something was cracking. And only those who love deeply see the cracks before others do. The world around her wasn't helping. Emily saw single friends experiencing intense romances, being desired, flowers, trips, passions. She also saw unhappy married friends, trapped in lifeless relationships. And she was caught in the middle, unsure of where she stood. She had someone who loved her, yes, but she felt she lacked spark. She lacked that feeling of being unique. Of being chosen every day. And it hurt more than she cared to admit. Because she knew Noah was good. That he didn't deserve doubts, much less distance. But she couldn't control the inner turmoil. It was as if something inside her was crying out for more, and she wasn't sure what that more was. There were nights when she watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling calmly, his features serene. And she wondered, why am I feeling this way? Instead of finding peace in the man who chose her every day, she felt guilty for no longer feeling the same enthusiasm. And she tried to compensate. She was more affectionate some days, more present on others. But it was as if she were fighting a part of herself. And this silent, internal struggle shaped the next steps of the story that was about to split in two. Nothing they experienced was a lie. There was no falseness in the love they built. But sometimes, time turns certainties into doubts. And doubts, when fed, become abysses. Amidst this scene of apparent tranquility and discreet affection, something was preparing to explode. Still invisible to those who only see what is said, but obvious to those who feel what is not. And it was at that point, at that very point where love and dissatisfaction intersect, that Noah and Emily's paths began, slowly and silently, to drift apart, without either of them having the courage to admit it. Yet. Noah had been sensing for weeks that something was different, but he wouldn't say it. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because, like so many who love, he preferred to believe that love survived even the absence of words. She thought I hadn't seen her kiss with her boss at that special party. But I saw it. I saw everything. From the half-open door of the side room, I saw the exact moment she smiled as if forgetting the world, rested her hand on his chest as if leaning on the certainty of affection, and, without hesitation, surrendered herself. It wasn't an accident, nor a mistake fueled by alcohol or the euphoria of a festive night. No. It was a choice. And choices, however hasty, carry consequences. I went to her with the divorce papers folded in my jacket pocket, my heart bleeding silently, my mouth dry of everything, love, trust, the future. She tried to deny it. She made an Oscar-worthy scene. Her look of shock, her voice trembling, her icy hands gripping my arm as if there was still something to hold on to. She begged. She cried. But the sound of the kiss still echoed in my head. All I could say was, I'm not here to argue. Just to close. And there I ended it. Not just a marriage. I ended a story. I ended a man who gave himself completely. Who made coffee before going out, who texted in the middle of the afternoon just to remind me how much he loved me. I ended the plans for a bigger apartment, the conversations about kids, the lazy Sundays with pizza and blankets. I ended the version of myself that believed love was enough. In the following days, her silence screamed louder than any excuse. And when she tried to contact me, it was too late. Her phone number became an unknown number. The memories, though still alive within me, were being buried one by one, like old photos stored in an attic smelling of abandonment. While she faced the emptiness of the room now without me, I began again, with short, staggering, but determined steps. I discovered that our hearts don't die all at once. They gradually relearn to beat to the rhythm of freedom. And that's when I met someone. Someone who didn't promise the world, but delivered presence. Someone who didn't rush to say, "I love you," but looked me in the eyes as if to say, "I'm here." It was different. It was calm. It was secure. And for the first time, after so long, I understood that peace can also be synonymous with passion. Because after a turbulent love, full of ups and downs, betrayals, and empty reconciliations, peace becomes the deepest love anyone can know. Meanwhile, she discovered what happens when you trade a sincere heart for a moment of vanity. Her boss, the very one she kissed as if he were the answer to all her needs, didn't want ties. He wanted distraction. And when the party was over, he disappeared. There were no more messages, no invitations, no promises. All she was left with was the echo of her own choices, resonating in the silence of the room where I used to leave her sleeping with a kiss on her forehead. Alone. Without him. Without me. Without anyone. And, worst of all, with guilt. Guilt is the worst kind of companion. It's silent, constant, and knows all the shortcuts of memory. She would walk around the house and see my pictures she didn't have the courage to take down. Or I would see the empty spaces on the walls where they had been. I would find my clothes forgotten in a drawer and cry. I would go to the supermarket and see my favorite juice, my cheap wine, my hot sauce. And everything hurt. Because it was real. Because it was over. And, unlike me, she didn't have a new life to stitch up the wounds. She only had the pieces, and they all pointed back at her. The cruelest thing about betrayal isn't the end of the relationship. It's what dies in the betrayed. The mirror changes. Breathing becomes heavy. Trust, even with another person, takes a long time to return. We begin to doubt our own worth. And for a long time, I thought I'd failed. That maybe I hadn't loved right, cared enough, listened to the signs. But no. Over time, I realized, those who cheat, betray themselves first. Because you have to believe you deserve less. That real love is boring. That stability is cold. And when they realize what they've lost, there's often no going back. She tried. She returned one day, weeks later, with sunken eyes and a haggard face. She carried a look that begged for redemption. She asked me for forgiveness, as if forgiveness were an eraser capable of erasing a knife mark. She said she'd been confused. That she felt alone, that I was distant, that she needed to feel wanted. I heard it all. But she no longer felt anger. Or hatred. Only a deep sadness, the kind that doesn't scream, it just weighs. Because, deep down, I knew, she only realized the gravity of it when there was no one waiting for her at the end of the road. I accepted her apology. Not for her. But for myself. Because carrying resentment is allowing pain to dwell unchecked in our hearts. And I had already paid too dearly for loving too much. When we met again, she cried, holding my hands with the same intensity as someone holding on to something that's slipping away. And she did. But not like before. It was a gentle, inevitable escape, like sand between my fingers. I told her it was okay, that I held no grudges, that I hoped she would be okay. And I meant it. But she knew, and so did I, that this was our last meeting. And so, each of us went our separate ways. She with regret. I with serenity. But fate has curious ways of rubbing the truth in our faces. Because true love, once lost, doesn't return. And she discovered this the cruelest way, trying to love again, but comparing. Searching for something that no longer exists. beating herself up for not appreciating it, and drowning in memories of what she destroyed with her own hands. While I, who was shattered, rebuilt myself. And found something rare, someone who loves me not for what I can offer, but for who I am, even in my silences. But what most impacted this story wasn't the end of the marriage. It was what she did, weeks after the separation. A lonely, painful, and unexpected gesture. A gesture that made me realize that, no matter how much we forgive, no matter how much we rebuild, certain wounds leave eternal scars. And it was this gesture that changed everything, forever. Because her heart couldn't bear to live in the same place where she was once truly loved. And when she realized nothing else would fill that void, she did something no one expected. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is condoned or romanticized. All the stories you hear are fictional, created with the purpose of showing how betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves deep scars. The moral is clear: it's not worth exchanging true love for empty moments. Now, get ready. Because what you're about to hear is a shocking, intense, and unforgettable story. Happy listening. Their story began like so many others that seemed destined for the ordinary, but which, for some reason hard to explain, transformed into something greater than expected. Noah was a reserved type, with a look that said more than his mouth could ever convey. He had a calm way of listening, as if every word spoken to him was precious. He worked in financial planning at a mid-sized company and lived a disciplined life, not out of coldness, but because he learned early on that the world rarely forgives the disorganized. He had a solid routine, an organized home, and a mind that always sought stability. When he met Emily, it wasn't by chance or fate, but by choice. Emily remained the same in many ways. She still laughed out loud when talking to her friends, still got excited when planning events, still said "good night" with a kiss on the cheek before bed. But there was something in the way she touched him, in the way she looked away when he watched her silently, something subtle, almost imperceptible, but that screamed inside him like a constant warning. Noah wasn't a paranoid man. Quite the opposite. He'd always believed that love was about trust, that true relationships couldn't survive surrounded by distrust. But there was a silence in her eyes, a haste in her gestures, an absence on Sundays at home that he could no longer ignore. Emily spent more time away. Events became more frequent, family dinners fewer and far between. She began to concoct last-minute appointments, late-night meetings, short trips that suddenly appeared. She still told him she loved him, still smiled at specific moments, but she seemed exhausted from being there. Noah began to notice her avoiding long conversations, breakfasts together, the little traditions they'd always made a point of maintaining. Her phone was now face down all the time, and her passwords changed. And yet, he tried to believe it was just a phase, that the stress of work and the grueling routine were taking their toll. But the more he tried to convince himself of this, the more the evidence piled up. He began to notice details he hadn't noticed before. New perfumes, automatic smiles when he used his phone, calls hung up too quickly. She was different, not physically, but in her soul. Her energy was no longer his, and although she was present in body, she had become absent in everything else. Noah didn't ask questions. He observed. And as he observed, his chest filled with a silence that ached. Because loving someone and feeling that person slipping away silently, little by little, without crying out, without fighting, is a cruel form of suffering. He stopped trying to force the connection. Not out of surrender, but out of dignity. He began to sleep earlier, to go out more with work colleagues, to fill the spaces she left vacant. And it was in this movement of distancing himself that he realized how much it hurt to love alone. Emily, for her part, was experiencing an internal conflict that even she didn't fully understand. She knew something was wrong, that her behavior was dissonant, but she tried to justify it to herself. She said she was tired, that she needed something new, that perhaps the problem was the routine, the relationship that lasted too long, the stability that suffocated her. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line she shouldn't have, even before she physically crossed it. The desire for novelty, for excitement, for feeling desired again pushed her closer to someone who represented exactly what her relationship no longer offered: adrenaline. The rapprochement with her boss was subtle. It began with more relaxed conversations after meetings, with exchanged smiles that went beyond the professional, with invitations disguised as networking. Emily let herself get carried away not because she didn't love Noah, but because she confused love with a need for stimulation. And before she knew it, she was in too deep. There was something about her boss's manner that made her feel that youthful thrill again, that mistaken idea that passion is only real when it comes with risk, danger, and secrets. The adrenaline of the forbidden began to dominate her thoughts, and Noah, for all his calm and predictable love, began to seem even more distant. But Emily wasn't cruel. On the contrary, she blamed herself. Every time she came home and saw Noah cooking dinner, or lying on the couch waiting for her with a sincere smile, she felt guilt clawing at her chest. And yet, she didn't stop. She kept going back to the same encounters, the same hidden hugs, the same kisses muffled by shame. And each time she did this, she lost herself more. Noah noticed. But he said nothing. Until the night of the party arrived. An important celebration for the company where Emily worked. An elegant event, where she would be involved from start to finish. She invited him formally, as if fulfilling a role. He accepted. He wanted to see. He didn't know what exactly, but he needed to be there, needed to understand with his own eyes what his heart had been screaming for days. They arrived together but parted almost immediately. Emily was nervous, distracted, too busy to pay attention to him. Noah didn't care. He walked through the rooms, observing the people, analyzing the faces, the conversations. He was a stranger in that busy, noisy world. Until, walking down the hallway that led to the backyard, he saw something. He heard first a muffled laugh, then a whisper, then silence. And there, through the crack of a half-open door, he saw the kiss. It didn't last more than a few seconds, but it was enough. It wasn't a thoughtless kiss, nor a fleeting moment. It was intimate, lingering. Charged with intention. And he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He stood there for a while, unable to move. His heart raced, his breath held, his mind trying to process what his eyes had already witnessed. When he managed to leave, he didn't return to the ballroom. He left the party without speaking to anyone. On the way home, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just drove in silence, replaying the image in his head like a movie that keeps replaying. That night, he didn't sleep. And for the first time in years, Emily didn't notice his emotional absence. She was too wrapped up in her own drama, her own turmoil. When she arrived home late, claiming he had to dismantle everything, he just nodded. He didn't ask anything. He didn't say anything. And that bothered her. In the days that followed, Noah acted with calculated coldness. There were no more spontaneous touches, no more smiles at breakfast. He responded as needed, followed his routine, but was distant. Emily sensed it, but didn't ask. She was too confused, too wrapped up in her own lies. She didn't know if Noah knew. She didn't know if she wanted to know. She tried to keep up appearances, but inside, every time she saw that neutral look, her heart sank. Because the worst kind of judgment is the one you don't say out loud. It's the one you feel in silence. Until one night, he arrived early. He calmly took off his shoes, went to his bedroom, grabbed something from his desk drawer, and returned to the living room. Emily was sitting, watching TV, distracted. He approached slowly, held out a manila envelope, and said in the firmest voice she'd ever heard, "Sign when you're ready." She took the envelope, opened it, and for a moment, the world stopped. The divorce papers were there, printed, signed by him. Her hands trembled, her eyes wide. She tried to say something, but he cut her off with a sentence that destroyed any attempt at justification: "I'm not here to argue. Just to get closure." She tried to deny it, tried to find some excuse, said she was confused, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she needed time, that it wasn't anything serious. But he remained motionless, looking at her with a piercing calm. That hurt more than yelling. More than accusing. Because it was clear that love had died silently, and that now, only dignity remained. And that very night, after he walked out the door without a backward glance, she realized that what she'd done wasn't just betraying a man. She'd betrayed a home, a history, a love that, even in silence, had always been there, whole and whole. But what she didn't know yet was that the greatest pain was yet to come. Because what happened after that separation was something she could never have predicted. And from that point on, everything truly began to fall apart. After he left, everything around her fell apart. The silence of the house that had once been a home now screamed. Every corner seemed to accuse her, every object betrayed what she had lost. She spent the next few days amidst missed phone calls, ignored messages, and memories that tortured her like ghosts. Noah hadn't made a fuss, hadn't sought revenge, hadn't hurled hateful words. He simply left. And this dignified absence was what hurt the most. Emily wallowed in trying to understand how she had let things get this way, tried to justify her actions to herself, but the more she searched for answers, the more lost she felt. She tried to rebuild herself with her routine, her work commitments, her remaining friends, but nothing filled the void of seeing that man leave her life without a glance in return. And it was when she thought she was handling everything as best she could that the true weight of the consequences fell upon her. It was a rainy afternoon when she decided to return to the apartment they'd lived in, seeking some kind of relief, perhaps finding traces of him still there. The lease was in her name, and after the separation, she'd chosen to stay, even though she knew every wall held stories that now hurt. Upon entering, she was overcome by a feeling of strangeness. There was something out of place, a different atmosphere, an absence more cruel than in the days before. As if the past had already been ripped away. She walked to the bedroom and, opening the bottom drawer of the dresser, found a small, blue-covered notebook she'd completely forgotten about. It was something Noah sometimes used to write down ideas, thoughts, lists. She sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and flipped through. The first few pages contained random scribbles, dates, everyday notes. But as she continued, she noticed the words changing tone. They were beginning to sound more intimate, as if he were writing to someone. It didn't take long for her to understand, they were letters. Letters written to her. Many of them. Some were long, others just a few sentences long. None had been delivered. Her hands trembled as she read. The letters weren't accusations, but confessions. He spoke of his fear of losing her, the silent pain of no longer feeling seen, the struggle to continue loving when the love was no longer reciprocated. On one page, he wrote that he felt small, invisible, and that he didn't know how to compete with her world. On another, he said he sometimes wanted to ask her if she still loved him, but held back for fear of the answer. And then she found the last letter. It was dated the morning after the party, the day he'd served her the divorce papers. The handwriting was firmer, but the content, heartbreaking. He wrote as if he were leaving everything there, his last words to someone who no longer listened. The letter ended with a sentence that kept hammering in her mind, "Today I realized I've already lost you. All I can do is accept it. But one day, you'll understand what you lost, too. And it will hurt." She slammed the notebook shut, brought her hands to her face, and wept with raw despair, as if she were being torn apart from within. For the first time, she felt not just regret, but true loss. She realized it wasn't just a phase, a mistake, a human failing. It was a decision. And that this decision had cost her something she might never recover. In the days that followed, she tried to focus on work, to rebuild something of herself, but nothing seemed to matter. The boss she'd become involved with now felt like a stranger. Conversations withered, meetings felt cold, almost awkward. She tried to find some comfort there, but all was empty. The emotion that had drawn her there had vanished, and all that remained was a meaningless relationship, sustained by moments that now seemed filthy, insignificant, even pathetic. And it was in this state that she saw him again. It was a chance encounter, on a random Saturday. She was leaving a cafe, distracted, when she saw him crossing the street on the other side, with another woman. He was different. Not physically, but in his manner. Lighter, more relaxed. He laughed at something she said, and held her hand naturally. Emily felt her heart race, her legs weaken. The woman beside him wasn't extraordinary. She was simple, but there was something in her gaze that disarmed her. It was the kind of look Emily hadn't seen in a long time. A look of genuine admiration. She couldn't move, just stood there, watching from afar as if witnessing a life that was once hers. And then he saw her. The smile on his face remained, but his eyes hardened. A brief, polite nod. A distant look. And he moved on. That vision destroyed her more than any argument, more than any absence. Because there, in that simple scene, she saw what she'd lost. And more than that, she saw that he had moved on. Truly. Without needing to humiliate her, without throwing it in her face, without resentment. He had simply rebuilt his life. And she was alone. She tried to maintain her composure until she got home, but as soon as she closed the door, she fell to the floor. She cried like she had never cried before. With guilt, with loss, with the knowledge that certain choices are like doors that close forever. A few weeks passed. Emily practiced daily the idea of reaching out to him. Not to win him back, but to truly ask for forgiveness. She needed to say out loud that she was sorry. That she acknowledged everything she'd destroyed. And when she finally found the courage, she called. His voice on the other end was calm. He listened silently. He let her speak. And she said it all. She cried. She begged for some attention, not to return, but to ease the weight she carried in her chest. And then he said, calmly, I forgive you. Because keeping this to myself would only hurt me. But I'm not going back. She thanked him, swallowing the lump in her throat, and hung up. And as much as that answer hurt, it was also liberating. Because right there, in that moment, she realized that forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. And that some losses are permanent. But what she never expected, what no one could have predicted, happened that night. Lying on the couch, reviewing memories, deleting photos, trying to reorganize her own chaos, she received a notification. A message from her former boss's wife. An unknown profile, a short message, I hope it was worth it. Startled, she clicked. There was a video attached. It was from the party. The exact moment of the kiss. Someone had recorded it. The video was being shared among close social circles, not out of revenge, but out of consequence. The wife found out, confronted her husband, and he denied it. But the video spoke for itself. And to protect his image, he completely shut Emily out. He blocked her, cut off contact, as if she had never existed. In the following days, everything fell apart. Co-workers began to avoid her, clients no longer wanted to associate themselves with her. But the most devastating thing wasn't the exclusion. It was the emptiness. The complete abandonment. Because now, even those who had gently surrounded her were no longer around. But none of that compared to what she felt every time she woke up and realized she had lost not only Noah's love, but his respect. And worse, her self-respect. Noah, on the other hand, was now a different man. Little by little, he rebuilt himself from the pain. He found in another woman what he no longer expected to find, peace. There were no games, no unanswered questions. There was silent complicity, simple smiles, and the discreet love he had always valued. When he thought about everything he had experienced, there was no hatred. Only learning. And in silence, as had always been his way, he moved on. But to this day, Emily carries the image of the blue notebook as a living reminder of what she destroyed. Because some mistakes are like tattoos on the soul, they don't fade with time. And they never, ever stop hurting. Without the support of her work, without the attention of her lover who had completely disappeared, and without the presence of Noah, who was now just a name echoing in her memory with weight and shame, Emily felt completely suspended in time, as if life had continued for everyone but her. The days lost their shape. She lost interest in her tasks, in the places she used to frequent, in the people who insisted that everything would pass. She began to avoid mirrors, as if she found in them the woman who destroyed her own history. In truth, she didn't have the strength to see how much she had changed. Her gaze was no longer the same, nor the tone of her voice, nor the way she walked. There was an incurable weariness that came not from her body, but from her soul. Determined not to go crazy, she sought therapy. Not to try to get back together with Noah, not with ulterior motives, but because she finally understood that she needed to face what was inside her. The sessions began difficult, with long silences and frustrated attempts to explain the inexplicable. But little by little, with great effort, she was able to look at herself without making excuses. The betrayal was just the final act in a series of failures, yes, but it was also a choice, and recognizing this was more painful than any external judgment. One day, at the end of a particularly difficult session, the psychologist asked, with a calm that seemed to penetrate all her defenses, "If you loved him, why did you cheat?" Emily stood still for seconds that seemed eternal. "Because I wanted to feel something. Anything. And now I would give anything to return to the silence he offered me, because today I know that silence was love." While she slowly rebuilt herself, Noah experienced a new moment. His relationship with the woman he'd met weeks after his marriage ended grew stronger and stronger. She was different in every way, but she shared the same outlook on life he'd always had, a simple but constant love. Someone who looked him in the eye without urgency, who didn't pressure him to be more than he was, who respected silence and shared Sundays with coffee and casual conversation. For the first time in years, Noah felt he didn't need to prove himself. He was accepted. And this healed him slowly. It was on an autumn afternoon, months after everything, that the inevitable reunion happened. Noah was in a small bookstore, the kind he used to frequent alone, where the aisles smelled of old pages and fresh memories. He was with his new companion, choosing a gift for her nephew, when he heard the voice. Low, hesitant, but unmistakable. He turned slowly. Emily was standing a few feet ahead, between two shelves. She looked fragile, but not defeated. Her gaze met his, and in an almost involuntary gesture, she moved closer. Noah's new companion, sensing the tension, discreetly moved away to make room. Emily, taking a deep breath, stopped in front of him. "I know I shouldn't have," she began, her voice trembling as if carrying a weight in her throat. "But I needed to thank you. For everything. For who you were. For what you endured. For the way you left." Noah remained silent for a few seconds, his expression serene, like someone who had already made peace with their past. "I didn't hold any grudges against you," he said, without raising his voice. "I just had to learn to move on." She smiled sadly, her eyes welling up. "You did it. And I understand now what I lost." For a few seconds, they sat in silence, amidst the soft rustling of pages and the subtle sound of the wind hitting the front door. Emily stepped a little closer, hesitant, and said, "Can I ask you a question?" Noah nodded. "Does she make you happy?" He glanced toward the back of the bookstore, where his new partner was studying a red-covered book, then back at Emily. "She makes me feel at peace. And today I know that's happiness." The answer was a silent punch to her chest. Not because there was any resentment in his words, but because there was truth. And that truth hurt more than any scream. She smiled, her eyes wet, and before turning to leave, she let out one last whisper, "Take good care of this love. Don't lose it, like I lost yours." He didn't answer. He just watched her leave, like someone watching the final scene of a film that no longer belongs to their story. That night, Emily walked aimlessly through the streets, not thinking about time, not checking her phone. The scene at the bookstore replayed endlessly in her mind. There was no resentment in Noah. There was resilience. And that was what tore her apart the most. Because she expected hurt, coldness, something that would make her feel less like a villain. But he didn't need that. He had chosen peace. And she remained trapped in the ruins of everything she had destroyed with her own hands. A few days later, something unexpected happened. One of the few mutual friends who still maintained some contact with them texted Emily, "I found something you might be interested in." It was in the donation box you left at the building. It was a box filled with old objects, clothes, notebooks, papers. Emily wasn't sure exactly what was in there, but when she opened it, she found an envelope marked with Noah's handwriting. Unread. "Just leave it in my name in case I disappear before I finish writing," read the note on the side. Inside was another letter. The last. Unlike the previous ones, this one seemed not to be written to be read. It was almost a confession. In it, Noah spoke of the pain he felt the week of the separation, the thoughts that invaded him, the feeling of being thrown away like something disposable. But he also spoke of starting over. Of the promise he made to himself that he wouldn't let that pain define him. And the letter ended with a sentence that brought Emily to her knees on the living room floor: "If I ever love again, it will be completely. Because love is only valuable when it's complete. Like the one I gave you, and that you threw away." Emily folded the letter carefully, as if touching something sacred. In that moment, everything became clear. It was no longer about winning back, about trying to erase the past. It was about acceptance. About understanding that not all mistakes can be fixed. That some things cannot be recovered. And that the greatest punishment for betraying someone who truly loved you isn't loneliness, it's remembering every day that that love was real. And that it will never be yours again. That same night, she went to the lake where they used to walk in the first months of their relationship. She sat on the rusty bench, watched the lights reflecting on the water, and took out of her pocket the ring she'd never had the courage to throw away. She stood there for minutes in silence, holding the small golden circle between her fingers. Then, she took a deep breath and released it. Not as someone trying to forget, but as someone finally accepting. And in that instant, something inside her was released. The pain didn't go away. The guilt didn't disappear. But for the first time, Emily understood that redemption doesn't always come with forgiveness or return. Sometimes, it comes with the courage to acknowledge, accept, and move on. Even if the path is lonely. Even if regret walks alongside. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Noah arrived home with the woman who was now walking beside him. They cooked dinner together, laughed at silly things, and shared a quiet kiss before sitting on the couch. And before going to sleep, he wrote a line in the new notebook he kept beside his bed: "I've started over. And for the first time, I carry no pain. Only gratitude for having learned, and for having found the peace I deserve." And there, on that ordinary night, in separate houses, two people lived opposite fates. One finding redemption in rebuilding. And the other learning, too late, that some loves only come once in a lifetime. And once they're lost, they never return. The silence that followed the reunion and the reading of the unpublished letter settled over Emily's life like a thick fog. It was no longer a vivid, throbbing pain, but a profound absence, made of memories and the recognition of all she had lost. She continued attending therapy, even though she could no longer speak of Noah frequently. His presence, though physically distant, still lingered in all her deepest thoughts, like a scar that doesn't burn but never fades. He had worked cautiously again, slowly rebuilding the trust of those remaining around him. But there was a difference in his behavior that everyone noticed. The energy that had previously overflowed was now measured, almost contained. Emily no longer laughed loudly, nor did she occupy spaces with the same impetus. She walked as if recognizing that something within herself had been definitively broken. It wasn't about regret. It was about knowing that regret, in and of itself, brings nothing back. The world moved on, and she was part of it, but in a different way. She began to write, not to publish, nor to show anyone, but as a way to record what hurt. She filled notebooks with fragments of her feelings, with questions she still didn't know the answers to, with accounts of good and bad days. Sometimes she wrote to him, even though she knew those words would never be delivered. In one passage, she wrote that she finally understood what it meant to love someone to the point of recognizing they were no longer worthy of returning. She had understood too late that love isn't just about passion, but also about loyalty and constancy. And that some decisions, even impulsive ones, even seemingly small ones, can cost a lifetime. At the same time, Noah was experiencing a completely different moment. The past existed, of course, as it does for everyone, but it no longer dominated. His current relationship was solid, built patiently, made of small touches that didn't require daily verification. There was no anxiety, no suffocating doubts. For the first time, he felt free to be who he was without needing to explain himself. He felt valued, but above all, at peace. The woman he was with had understood his past not as something to be fought, but as part of who he was. And that, for him, was the greatest gift. However, even with this peace of mind, there was a part of him that still reflected on everything he'd experienced. Not with anger, nor with sadness, but with maturity. He knew his previous marriage hadn't been a complete mistake. He'd been loved for a time, and what happened next was a consequence of many things, including flaws on both sides. But the betrayal, that, he never forgot. Not for the act itself, but for the way it destroyed something he believed was unbreakable. This awareness led him to maintain firm boundaries, even when Emily tried to reach out with occasional messages, always respectful and never with apparent ulterior motives. She said she simply wanted to share thoughts, share lessons, sometimes send an excerpt from a book or movie they both enjoyed. Noah responded politely but never encouraged contact. Over time, the messages lessened, until they disappeared completely. He knew it was her way of coping with her pain, perhaps a way to atone for her guilt. And, to a certain extent, he understood. But he no longer belonged in that chapter. He had turned the page with effort and deserved to live the new without carrying the debris of what was left behind. Meanwhile, Emily faced a consuming moral dilemma. In one of her last conversations with her therapist, she confessed that there was a kind of pain even harder to bear than regret, the fact that, despite everything, she knew she still loved him. But it wasn't a possessive love, nor even a romantic one. It was the deep awareness that, at some point in her life, she had held something rare, real, and honest in her hands. And that, through selfishness or confusion, she had destroyed it. The love she felt now was mature, sad, and silent. It didn't ask for a return. It didn't ask for a chance. It simply existed, like a living memory of what once was. It was then that the idea of writing a letter came to her. Not to make amends, nor to apologize again, but to tell him how that story had transformed her. How that loss had forced her to rebuild herself from scratch. How she'd come to see the world through different eyes. She wrote slowly for weeks. She reread it countless times, rewrote it just as many times. And when she finally felt she'd said everything she needed to, she put the letter in an envelope and put it in a drawer. I wasn't sure I'd send it. But the simple act of writing it was a relief. Noah, meanwhile, was facing a different dilemma. His current partner, with whom he'd had a light and stable relationship, was beginning to touch on more serious topics: marriage, children, future plans. And although he felt he was on the right path, there was still a part of him that hesitated. Not because of Emily, not because of a lack of love, but because the trauma of betrayal had left him with an almost instinctive need for caution. He began to wonder if it would ever be possible to love with the same abandon as before, if that kind of love, unconditional, innocent, still existed within him, or if it had been buried under the shards of the past. This doubt haunted him more than he would admit. The woman beside him noticed. She was sensitive enough to notice the changes, the absence of words in moments when he would have otherwise spoken easily. One night, sitting on the couch, she held his hand and said tenderly, "I don't want to compete with what hurt you. I only want to walk with what heals you." Noah didn't respond right away. But he kept that phrase as a reminder that loving again took courage. And that maybe it was time to truly allow himself to. Meanwhile, Emily decided to leave the apartment where they lived. She had tried for months to transform that place into something new, something her own, but every corner carried the shadow of a time that no longer existed. She rented a smaller, simpler space in a different neighborhood, where no one knew her story. She wanted to start over authentically. She began teaching at a local college, something she had always dreamed of doing. She discovered she could be useful, even with the past she carried. One day, a student commented that she admired her for speaking so profoundly about choices and consequences. Emily smiled, with hidden regret, and replied, "It's just that some lessons we only learn after we've lost everything." And so, two paths ran parallel, but in opposite directions. From time to time, his name would surface in some thought, in some memory, but she no longer felt the same despair. The pain had transformed into something more serene, almost respectful. She knew his life no longer belonged to her. And that, perhaps, it never had. She was the one who failed to recognize the value of what she had. But something still bothered her. A slight but persistent unease, the idea that she needed to find a way to end the story with dignity. Not for him. For herself. She didn't want everything to be suspended in time. She wanted to put an end to it. But not with anger, nor with sadness. With truth. She decided, then, that she would deliver the letter. Not in person. She would leave it at the entrance of the building where he lived, with no return address, just her name on the signature, in case he wanted to know. And so she did. She walked to the building with the envelope in her bag, her heart racing, but her mind steady. She handed it to the doorman with simple instructions. And left without looking back. Across town, Noah, upon arriving home, received the envelope and took his time opening it. He waited for night to fall, for the house to quiet down, for the world to fall silent. He sat in the living room armchair, a cup of tea in his hands, and read it. He read it calmly, without interruption. The letter didn't ask for an apology, nor for a reconciliation. It was a testimony. An honest outburst about everything she'd experienced since he left. About how every action carried weight, how every day without him was a lesson. And at the end, a simple but profound sentence, "You were the best I ever had. And what I lost for myself." He folded the letter carefully, put it in a box along with the few mementos he'd decided to keep, and took a deep breath. He felt no anger. No pity. He simply felt certain that he had done the right thing in leaving. And that now, more than ever, he was ready to live the present with the intensity that the past had once stolen. Time, with its precise ability to align what seemed out of sync, began to close the final cycles. And even though some questions remained unanswered, they no longer mattered. Because sometimes, the true answer lies in what we choose not to repeat. And in what we choose to leave behind. The envelope had been read, carefully folded, and put away without haste, but the letter Emily had written didn't leave Noah's mind as quickly as he'd imagined. There was a sincerity there that was hard to find, not in the content itself, but in the way she exposed herself without trying to justify herself. And even though he'd closed the door on the past, it was impossible to ignore that this account contained parts of him too. Their story had existed, had been intense and real for a time. It was no longer the center of his life, nor his anchor, but it was still a memory that pulsed silently, like a soft echo from a distant home. That same night, as he lay beside his new companion, he watched her sleep for a few minutes. He had learned to value that kind of silence, the one accompanied by presence, quiet affection, serene loyalty. He was at peace, but now, for the first time in a long time, he felt that perhaps there was something more he could do, not for Emily, but for himself. In the days that followed, Noah began revisiting places that marked phases of his life. It wasn't nostalgia. It was more like a kind of closure. He returned to the square where he used to walk with Emily, to the cafe where he'd written some of the undelivered letters, even to the small shop where, years ago, he'd chosen his engagement ring. He didn't cry during any of these moments. He simply observed, breathed, and acknowledged that all of this was part of who he was, not because it determined his present, but because it helped shape what he no longer was. Deep down, he knew her letter was an attempt at reparation. But he also knew it wasn't his place to offer comfort to her regret. The pain she felt, however genuine, needed to be faced by her, not by him. Even so, something inside him drove him not to let their story end with just one absence. It was then that she decided to write. Not a reply, not a long letter, not a rant. Just a note, short, direct, but full of meaning. She wrote it by hand, without erasures, on a simple piece of white paper, and left it at the same entrance where she had left her letter weeks before. Emily received the envelope as she was leaving for class. She hadn't expected anything more. She thought he hadn't even read it. She sat on a bench in a nearby park and, with trembling hands, opened it. The paper contained only 3 lines. I read it. I understood it. And now I know it's all in its place. There is nothing left between us, but there is respect. Take care of yourself, like I did when you didn't know how yet. Emily stood there for minutes, her eyes fixed on that note, feeling something impossible to name. There was no promise, no hope, no anger. It was just an elegant full stop, the kind rarely seen in real life. She folded the paper and tucked it into her coat pocket. For the first time in a long time, she felt light. The cycle had ended, and not with shouts, slammed doors, or deleted messages. It had ended with truth. With maturity. And, ironically, with the same silence he always offered, which she took too long to understand. Meanwhile, Noah's days continued with the peaceful rhythm he'd always sought. But something new was growing in his current relationship. The woman walking beside him began talking about starting a family. She brought the subject up with affection, without pressure, but with a clarity that brooked no evasion. Noah listened, reflected, and gradually discovered he was ready. Ready to begin a new story without ghosts, without guilt, without fear of repeating past mistakes. One quiet evening, after dinner, he held her hand and told her he was ready. Not on impulse, not to erase memories, but because he had healed. And now, for the first time, he wanted to build something whole, not with someone who demanded proof of love, but with someone who chose him in silence, day after day. Emily, on the other hand, found her way to rebuild in her simple routine. She began teaching creative writing classes to teenagers, and there she found a space for redemption. She taught how to transform pain into narrative, how to use words to find meaning where there seemed to be none. The students didn't know her personal story, but they felt she spoke with authority. Some identified with her, others simply admired her. She didn't talk about betrayal or lost love, but about choices. About how every decision shapes a path. In one of her classes, a student asked her, "Do you believe in second chances?" She smiled with discreet sadness and replied, "I do, but I've also learned that some first chances are unique. And that losing one of them teaches us more than any new beginning." Weekends became moments of introspection. I read a lot, wrote, walked. I avoided parties, avoided reunions. Not out of shame, but out of respect for the new space I was trying to build. A space that no longer depended on the gaze of others, but on my own conscience. Sometimes, he wrote notes he never sent. Other times, I simply took a deep breath and accepted the day as it was. Little by little, I began to understand that peace isn't the absence of pain, it's the decision to carry on, even when it still hurts. An unexpected event confronted her with a choice that would test everything she had learned. She was invited to give a talk at a literature conference, and among the attendees was the woman who was now part of Noah's life. She didn't recognize her immediately, but when she saw the name tag, she understood. There was a sudden unease, but it was soon replaced by a strange kind of serenity. At the end of the event, the two ended up alone for a few minutes in the breakout room. There was an awkward silence between them, until Noah's new companion spoke, without aggression, "I know who you are." Emily nodded, without looking away. "And I know who you are too." The woman took a deep breath, then said, "I have nothing against you. He overcame you with far more class than anyone could. I just wanted you to know that." Emily replied firmly, but without arrogance, "I never doubted his greatness. I just recognized it too late." They stared at each other for a few more seconds. There was no argument there. Two completely different worlds, for a brief moment, crossed paths. There were no more words. There was no need. The woman left the room, and Emily stood there, staring at the cold cup of coffee on the table, feeling that this encounter, however uncomfortable, had sealed the past once and for all. There was nothing left to hold on to. No resentment, no longing. There was only an immense lesson learned, impossible to erase. On the way home, she wrote a final page in her diary, saying that if life gave her the chance to love someone like Noah again, she wouldn't hesitate. But now she knew she didn't deserve it then. Not yet. And maybe never again. But she would live in such a way that if a new love came, she would be ready. Not to ask, not to demand. But to give, completely, as she had never been able to do before. As the world around them changed, two hearts that were once one now beat in different rhythms, but without weight, without guilt. Between them stood a silent bridge of respect, built from the rubble of a destroyed history, but transformed into a lesson. And sometimes, that's all one can hope for in a worthy ending. Because not all love ends in return. Sometimes, it ends in growth. And this is the kind of ending that leaves scars that don't hurt, they only teach. Time moved forward as if in a silent rush to wash away everything that once hurt. The months piled up in seasons that passed almost without warning, and little by little, each person's life found its course, not by chance, but by insistence. Noah and his partner formalized their union in a discreet ceremony in the garden of a house they chose together and carefully renovated, brick by brick, as if rebuilding the soul through the walls. There was no pomp, no hundreds of guests, just essential people, sincere glances, and vows made with a clean heart. There, he didn't repeat promises torn by old wounds. He made new ones. He said he would love unhurriedly, that he would respect the silences and celebrate the joys shared. And at the end of the night, he sat beside the woman he chose and understood, with an almost sacred relief, that he had truly found peace. Not the peace sought as an escape, but the one achieved after the storm, when love no longer needs to prove anything. It was the certainty that everything that hurt taught him to love better, but also to love himself more truly. His new partner didn't live in the shadow of what he had been. She never had to compete with memories, because she never wanted to occupy spaces that didn't belong to her. She built a relationship with him based on the present, without the pressure of healing wounds she didn't inflict. And that made all the difference. They didn't carry unrealistic expectations, nor ghosts between the sheets. They shared their time lightly and built a future without looking back. Noah was now a whole man. And even though the marks of pain still lingered somewhere hidden, they no longer hurt. They were scars, yes, but the kind that remind us of strength, not of failure. He never again had to write letters that wouldn't be delivered. He never again had to silence feelings. Now, there was a voice. There was reciprocity. And there was, above all, deservingness. Emily followed a solitary but dignified path. She didn't get back together with anyone, didn't try to fill spaces with empty presences. She discovered that solitude, when lived well, teaches more than 1,000 fleeting relationships. She continued teaching, writing texts that touched young people who, unknowingly, carried the same internal dilemmas she once experienced. She was invited to speak in other cities and began publishing short articles on love, guilt, and emotional reconstruction. Her writing spread, not because of the pain she carried, but because of the maturity with which she addressed what few have the courage to face, the real consequences of their own choices. But even with recognition, a stable routine, and a reorganized life, there were nights when silence still tightened her chest. On those nights, there was no anger, only acceptance. She knew that not everything can be rebuilt. That some stories end before the heart wants them to. And that certain mistakes, while they don't define who she is today, were big enough to shape who she no longer wants to be. An invitation arrived in the middle of a random month. A conference in another city, on literature and emotional psychology. She accepted calmly, but something about the organization's name caught her attention. It was a foundation Noah's new wife helped manage, focused on social projects for teenagers. Emily knew there was a good chance she'd meet her again, and she didn't back down. She traveled, delivered her talk with clarity and depth, received respectful applause, and at the end of the event, ran into her in the hotel lobby. This time, there was no hesitation. The two greeted each other politely, and for a brief moment, they stood side by side, observing the city through the large glass window. Neither spoke of the past. Neither needed to rehash what had happened between them. But the woman, with serenity in her eyes, said something Emily would never forget: some endings are hard, but they have to happen for good things to begin. Emily smiled genuinely, thanked her with a simple gesture, and continued on her way. On the last day of that conference, Emily walked alone downtown and entered an old bookstore. She ordered a coffee, chose a random book, and sat in a secluded corner. As she leafed through the pages, her gaze fell on a couple sitting a few feet away. They laughed softly, shared a piece of cake, exchanged tender glances. It wasn't Noah and his wife, but the image weighed heavily on her. It was familiar. It was beautiful. And at the same time, it was a reminder that some scenes never repeat themselves in real life. She closed the book, left her coffee half drunk, and left, walking silently through the streets, dimly lit by the end of the day. That night, she wrote her last entry in the journal she'd been keeping for almost 2 years. In it, she no longer spoke of loss, nor of regret. She spoke of acceptance. About the kind of peace that comes not from achieving something, but from learning to live with what cannot be changed. And at the bottom of the page, she wrote, "I was not forgiven by him with words, but I was freed by myself with truth." Time continued to pass, as it always does. And their paths, though different, continued peacefully. Noah continued to build a solid life, surrounded by peaceful love, conscious choices, and a healthy routine. Emily, in turn, found purpose in helping others avoid repeating their mistakes. The world is often cruel to those who make mistakes, but it can also be generous to those who have the courage to change. And it was in this balance that she found what she needed to carry on. She didn't forget Noah. She didn't forget the pain. But she transformed both into fuel to never return to who she once was. If you've made it this far, you've certainly felt the weight of this story, the choices, the losses, the reactions, and the consequences. Now I want to know, what did you think of this story? What part touched you most? Would you have acted differently in any of the characters' shoes? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your voice matters a lot to us. And of course, if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Every week, a new intense and exciting story, full of twists and turns and reflections. This story reminds us that betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It hurts the most precious thing between two people, trust. It tears apart families, shatters plans, and uproots dreams. And often, what's done in a second can reverberate throughout a lifetime. Cheating isn't just a mistake. It's a rupture. A deep cut that leaves scars even when everything seems healed. And remember, this channel does not condone any kind of betrayal. Here, we tell stories that show real pain, without romanticization or glamour. Our intention is one, to show, clearly and truthfully, that choosing loyalty, listening, and caring is still, and always will be, the noblest path.